Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here, now with a first class honours degree in English literature and creative writing. So what better way to spend my summer break before the MA begins than writing more essays? This is video 1 of a series where I do a lot of English lit style character analysis and explore the character development of various characters from the Umbrella Academy, which is my favourite show of my entire life so far because, as you may know, I am obsessed with good character writing and dysfunctional family dynamics in fiction. This video was going to be an analysis of the character development of the whole Academy plus Lila, but season 2 gave me so much beautiful stuff to work with that I've decided to make this a small series of videos focusing on each character in turn. I made a video a while back taking a more serious and psychological look at our characters, discussing how each member of the Academy displayed different ways in which adults who were abused or suffered trauma as kids can carry that trauma through to adulthood. As several unhelpful people pointed out, yes, I know it's a fun show, but I think the reason it has such emotional weight and resonance and manages to appeal to people from outside the usual demographic of the genre is that it's the story of a group of siblings or foster kids who were abused by their parent, who grow up separated and deeply unhappy because of the trauma, and are tentatively coming back together as a family as adults. It's a superhero show, it's time travel, it's sci-fi, but it's held together by a compelling and pretty heartwarming story of adult victims of childhood abuse finding strength as a family unit. And it's funny because they're all in their 30s, have additional powers to contend with, were essentially child celebrities with the egos and detachment from reality which comes with that, and are so inexperienced at being part of a functioning, loving, reliable family group that watching any scene of a group of the siblings together is either heartwarming comedy gold or painfully tragic. But this is not a superhero show, this is a family drama with superheroes. If you wanted to check out the first video I made on the Umbrella Academy, it's titled How the Umbrella Academy Nails the Fallout of Childhood Abuse, and the link to that is in the description box. I'm going to start this series with Luther, number 1. Luther is the most unfairly disliked character in the show, and it's always made me sad. What I think season 2 does so brilliantly is really zero in on his insecurities, his sensitive nature, and his trauma. I could make a whole video in defense of Luther, not excusing his actions, but showing why he went there and why his actions demonstrate that he's another victim of abuse by their father who deserves the same compassion as the rest of the siblings. I guess this kind of is a defense of Luther, really, but even if you don't agree, stick around if you have the time and see if I can change your mind on number 1. I spoke a lot about Luther in season 1 in my first video, and my views on him honestly haven't changed at all. I am still a Luther sympathizer. Luther is the most loyal of the siblings, the one who puts the needs of others before his own. He's very vulnerable as a character and easily manipulated. All of his actions in season 1 came from 2 places. One is him feeling responsible for the others because that was how his father made him feel, like he had to lead. And I just want to add here that Luther is a perfect example of toxic masculinity in action, because although Luther is pushed to be assertive and take charge, to not show his emotions or weakness, the real Luther is deeply emotional, super sensitive, and actually pretty gentle. Instead of working collaboratively with the others, in series 1, Luther tries to be the man his father wanted him to be and lead, viewing his emotions and compassion as meaningless. It's a perfect demonstration of how toxic masculinity doesn't mean the man is toxic. It means that the hyper-masculine, assertive expectations he has to live up to and the excess responsibility on his shoulders only end up hurting him and those around him. And before people go in on Luther for this, a big fan favourite Diego also holds these same ideals in season 1, as part of their rivalry is in their struggle to be number 1, to take charge and to lead. The second reason for Luther's actions in season 1 is his inevitable breakdown at his father's treatment of him, which comes way later than all the others, because owing to Luther's loyalty and desire to please and therefore be accepted and loved, Reginald had a stronger hold over him. Reginald had got so far into Luther's head that while the others realised the toxicity of the environment and got out of there, Luther couldn't go. Remember the scenes with him riding a bicycle around the academy on his own, sadly eating a meal? Luther feels responsible for other people, even his father. Simply leaving his father alone in that old house with none of his children present and a world that needed saving wasn't an option for loyal number 1. Luther actually sees himself as looking after their father, which is echoed in his Season 2 relationship with Jack Ruby, who he tells Five he takes good care of. I'll talk more about Luther's relationship with Jack Ruby later, but what we see in Luther's relationship with his dad is that Luther finds comfort in being the loyal child that is needed, or thinks that he's needed. Luther's personality is actually that of a caretaker or caregiver, which is a far cry from the way people seem to read him. And again, I'll come to that core aspect of his character in a bit. So when Luther's ugly side comes to the fore at the end of Season 1, it's because he realises he's reached 30 years old without comprehending he was being abused the whole time. He feels embarrassed, hurt, ashamed, angry, and confused. And I think it was important we saw this moment happen on screen for at least one of the siblings, to drive home how distressing that moment is. Luther isn't any worse than the others, it's just that we get to see his reaction to the trauma and abuse happen right in front of us. I think it's pretty obvious that all the other siblings have already been through that stage, which is why they're not the ones acting out and being their ugliest selves. And it is sad that people hate Luther for being the last one to reach that point, because part of his tragedy is that despite being number one, he's behind his other siblings in terms of development. A lot of people seem to consider later Season 1's version of Luther as the baseline for his personality, but I would argue we are actually seeing Luther in crisis at the end of that series, at probably the worst moment of his entire life. So I certainly wouldn't say that's the benchmark for him. All the siblings act up when they're emotional and faced with something that reminds them of their trauma. That's not just Luther's thing. Diego actually throws a knife at Luther, which cuts his skin, and that's at Reginald's funeral. Diego's aim is perfect, so that's no mistake. And also, Luther was the one who loved their father the most at the time of his death, so he was grieving. Diego ends up venting a lot of his rage at Reginald at Luther, and actually also Vanya. Alison is pretty cruel to Vanya in Season 1, snapping at her through her own pain, and Vanya cuts Alison's throat in fear, lashing out as she has her own breakdown and realises what happened to her. Klaus is an exception because he lashes out at himself rather than others and simply drugs and drinks away the pain, although he does yell for Diego to hit Luther at Reginald's funeral. And we can't say that Five is exactly kind to his siblings in Season 1. While under the control of their father, or still forced to be a part of that world, all of the siblings are at their ugliest. Luther just so happens to still be disentangling himself from that toxic environment and their father's control in Season 1. I would argue that at the end of the first season, we see both Vanya and Luther as their worst selves, the way that Reginald made them. And that's why I love Season 2 so much. It did exactly what I wanted in continuing to focus on Luther's journey of acceptance and recovery from the abuse, because as we know, the light bulb moment of revelation doesn't actually make everything okay. That's just the first step. So Luther drops into Season 2 in 1962, and remember, he's the sibling who, despite living alone on the moon for so long, has the least experience of being out in society on his own. Luther is extremely immature in this regard. All his life he's lived at the academy and followed orders. He's going to be the one that struggles the most to survive. The first description we have of Luther by Eliot is as the big, sensitive one who cried a lot, kept coming back to the alley, and sat around for hours calling Alison's name. This is a masterful way to reintroduce Luther, because he is a very lost character who has reached his 30s without independence. It creates immediate sympathy for him, and I hope it started causing some realizations for the people that hated him so much in Series 1. I want to add too, not as an I told you so, but okay, maybe it is an I told you so, that the Luther we see this series isn't a new character. He's an extension of what we've seen before. Every positive trait we see in Luther this series can be traced back to Season 1. Only back then he was the Winter Soldier, and now he gets to be Bucky Barnes. What we learn later in Season 2 is that Luther's first action after realising nobody is coming to help him is to try and find his father, the man he devoted his life to. He's the only sibling that tried finding their father to seek shelter and help, probably because the others have long since realised they'll find no compassion there. The sequence where Luther tells Diego and Five about his humiliating encounter with their father is one of the saddest in the show for me. We see that Luther is dirty, hungry, and doesn't even have enough change to pay for his bus ride. But just as he's done all his life, he gives everything he has for his father. We know as viewers that he's going to get a horrible surprise, which only makes his hopeful practicing of what exactly he's going to say to introduce himself to his father even worse. Luther is fragile, but he's ultimately hopeful too. Until this meeting with Reginald, there's the sense that Luther still believes everything is going to be alright. It has to be, because Luther can't conceive of failure. He wasn't taught to even entertain the notion. When they meet at the party and Luther introduces himself, it isn't the idea of time travel which is the problem for Reginald. He already knows that's a possibility. The reason he ultimately gives for rejecting his son is that he thinks Luther isn't good enough. Reginald tells him, "I have a deep dislike of children. I do not have them, nor do I intend to have them. But if for some reason I did, I would expect more from them than a scruffy face, poor hygiene, and your grotesque simian proportions." What we actually get to see here is Luther finally letting go of his idea of their father as a flawed but ultimately good figure who only wanted what was best for his children. What Luther gets is confirmation of what his siblings have tried to tell him all along, that Reginald never loved or liked them. Reginald himself says he despises children. This makes it clear to Luther that the only reason he ever had the siblings was for their powers and abilities. Real parental love is when you love your child at their best and worst, when they need help and when they can help you. Luther realises quite publicly, and through no fault of his own, because he can't help looking scruffy, that when he's not being his obedient, clean, useful best, Reginald is frankly disgusted by him. Looking at real-world psychology, that's interesting when we think about kids with toxic parents. Children should be able to show their less pleasant sides, to be forgiven when they make mistakes, to be loved at their ugliest. A parent will love them unconditionally, and a child should know that if they make a mistake or don't present their best face, they're still loved and valued. In more toxic parenting, a child learns that it's perfection or nothing, because without being perfect all of the time, they have no worth. Of course, it's normal for a parent to encourage a child to progress and to achieve their best, but not to the extent that failure to reach their expectations means being disowned or no longer loved. Think about it in terms of academia. A parent who demands A grades constantly with anything less resulting in shame and punishment, with no recognition of intentions or hard work put in. This is the first time Luther has ever failed his father, and it isn't even his fault. Luther has tried his best. He always does. But showing a more human, vulnerable side of himself only results in rejection, which is why I think Luther is such a strong character, in that he doesn't let that experience result in him hiding his vulnerability, as I'll get to later. Reginald then says the worst thing possible. He tells Luther that he has a stench of failure about him, and that he has to get out. Those are Luther's two nightmares, being a failure and being rejected. And the poor guy gets both of these on the same day, and he's stuck in the 60s, and he has nowhere to go. Overall though, I'm glad Luther had this experience, because it seems to be what saves him, along with his siblings' input, from losing his whole life to his father and his ideals. As we see in Season 1, even the death of Reginald wasn't enough to free Luther. It looks like the moment of actual rejection, the worst case scenario actually happening, was what he needed to finally let go. Otherwise, we might have seen him continue to try and live up to Reginald's flawed ideals. I have a suggestion, and it's about Pogo's backstory. Now, watching Pogo's backstory in Season 2 also gave me a lot to talk about, because we get to see Pogo as a baby and watch his journey into space. Some people have asked about the purpose of that sequence, as it doesn't seem necessary to the plot, but I think the meaning of the sequence is pretty clear. Pogo is the original Luther, the first ever #1. The parallels and the way the scenes are shot are too huge to miss. I think the show is telling us what Luther's other life might have been. Think about it. Pogo is stolen as a child, brought up as part of an experiment, with the people he thinks care about him actually using him to advance their aims and train him for dangerous missions. Like Luther, he's terribly wounded, and Hargreeves uses a serum on him, which seems to be the reverse of what Luther is injected with, as the Pogo we know has human mannerisms and a human voice. Pogo is changed against his will, made neither one thing or the other, and as a result of this, ends up giving his life serving Reginald loyally, believing he owes the man his life, without ever considering that it was Reginald and the original Grace that took his life from him. Luther's superhero name, or the name his fans called him when he was younger, was Space Boy, so I certainly think there's something to be said for those parallels and perhaps the way that Reginald views Luther. Without his siblings coming back for Reginald's funeral, and Five returning to them to try and stop the apocalypse, Luther would probably have become just like Pogo, even with Reginald dead. In the iconic dance scene in Season 1, we see Pogo sitting quietly in his basement room, almost part of the furniture himself. That could have been Luther, just living in that house and never being free. Season 2 makes Pogo a more tragic character, despite his complicity, which is why it doesn't make sense that people would hate Luther, but not Pogo. It's the same story, only Luther has siblings that love him and believe in him, know the abuse he's suffered, and despite issues they have to work through, know that he's vulnerable. Remember this eulogy Pogo gives back in Season 1, Episode 1. In all regards, Sir Reginald Hargreeves made me what I am today. For that alone I shall forever be in his debt. He was my master and my friend, and I shall miss him very much. He leaves behind a complicated legacy. Pogo, like Luther, seems to overestimate his importance to Hargreeves. After all, it's not kind or loving to make a so-called friend watch you die and then hide terrible secrets from your children. Pogo is content with Reginald as his master, just like Luther, accepting the caretaker role. As I said, Pogo shouldn't feel in Reginald's debt because Reginald took him as a child and trained him for missions, resulting in a terrible accident and a whole new life with no independence, feeling like a monster. When Diego brings this up with Luther in Season 1, he cruelly tells him that Reginald turned him into a monster and left him on the moon, and that he should hate him more than any of them. But Luther, like Pogo, makes excuses. He says he had a difficult decision to make and he made it, because that's what leaders do. You can't understand Luther's character without remembering this subservience to Reginald and how he's been trained into it over years and years. Leadership means sometimes causing others pain, and that's okay, as long as it's for the so-called greater good. His dad could do all that to him, and Luther convinced himself that he still loved him, which is why Luther associates love with sacrifice, and even believed that taking away Vanya's capacity to be a threat wouldn't mean he didn't love her, just that he, as the leader, knew what was best for her. It's learned behaviour, because Reginald has groomed Luther for this since birth. So how does Luther develop in Season 2? Because I think he's one of the siblings that develops the most. At first, Luther seems to have sunk back into old patterns. As 5 comments, Luther responds to age and authority and has daddy issues, which explains why he ends up working as a body man for Jack Ruby, the notorious gangster. Luther needs a father figure to idolise and to care for, and just like with Reginald, he takes all the hits, while Ruby reaps the rewards. Ruby calls Luther his #1 guy, further emphasising that he's a substitute for Reginald in Luther's life. Luther is so naive and trusting that Ruby showing the occasional kindness to him is all he needs to believe he's a good man. The fact that Ruby is the guy to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald doesn't ring alarm bells for Luther, who isn't one to believe in conspiracies or look deeper than what he's told is the truth. When 5 questions Luther's choice of boss, Luther tells him to watch it because Jack's a good friend. What we learn from this is that Luther doesn't know what it means to have a real friend, not someone from outside the family unit. From what we see of Jack Ruby, he is no friend to Luther. He exploits him and exists in a position of authority, requiring Luther to toe the line. Luther is so heartbreakingly tentative to ask Ruby a favour, and so pleased when Ruby helps him to find Alison, believing that this one act makes their friendship real. When Luther throws a fight in an act of self-harm, Ruby's reaction is one of rage. Just like Luther's experience with Reginald after the long bus ride, one mistake results in total rejection. The scene where Ruby visits Luther in his rooms is especially telling for me. We get a glimpse here of the abuse Luther has been trained to take, and perhaps see more of how he lived with Reginald. It's uncomfortable to see this huge man with such physical capability, with actual super strength, shrinking back from a smaller man yelling abuse at and manhandling him. Vanya is the voice of the viewer here, spotting the problem instantly and telling Ruby to leave him alone. Luther still doesn't seem to see it though. He blames himself for his failing, and Jack's reaction tells Vanya to leave so she doesn't see what he thinks is weakness, and then takes his pain out on the wall, not a person. Luther's association with Ruby and the way he sees his role in their relationship brings me back to the idea of Luther as a natural caretaker and caregiver. People tend to regard Luther as the most cold of his siblings, but if we look back at Season 1, even when he was under his father's control, that's simply not the case. I've made a list of moments from Season 1, or events that happened before the events of Season 2, where we can see Luther's potential for being kind, supportive and sensitive, which makes sense seeing as he was taught to take responsibility for the rest of his siblings. As kids, when the Hargreaves are brought to say goodnight to Reginald, who isn't interested, they're sent off to bed by Grace. Ben looks genuinely upset by this, and we can see Luther being the one to put his arm around him as they go. At Ben's funeral, when Alison tells Reginald that Ben's death wasn't their fault, Luther reaches out to her in both a protective, comforting motion and a subtle warning to stop her and keep her from their father's anger. When Five shows up in episode 1 through the blue portal, Luther rushes to the front of the group and tells his siblings to get behind him because he senses potential danger. When Five insults Diego, telling him he'd understand if he was smarter, and Diego jumps up to presumably get his revenge, Luther gets in Diego's way to prevent violence. Then in episode 5, when Diego discovers Patch has been killed, he goes to attack Five, but Luther swiftly intervenes to protect Five again, literally holding Diego in place until he stops trying to hurt him. When Five wants to kill an innocent gardener in episode 5, Luther is horrified and tells him that's not what they do, that he can't let innocent people die, no matter how many people it might save. When Five tells him that's just his life now, and nothing but an equation and weighing up probability, Luther tells Five he knows he's still a good person, and that he's not on his own anymore. Even with prickly Five, Luther is trying to emotionally support and care for him. In episode 6, Alison tells Luther he's the sweetest, kindest man she's ever known, and we can see that in our flashbacks to Luther as a kid. Even during his breakdown in episode 7 when he's drunk, he tells Klaus he doesn't want the others to see him like this because it would only hold them back, and what they're doing is too important. Klaus also looks shocked and totally wrong-footed when Luther cries on his shoulder, because this is out of the ordinary for him. Luther is usually the supporter, not the crier. Ben tells Klaus in episode 7 that if he was in trouble, there is nothing Luther wouldn't do to save him, which Klaus reluctantly accepts. And in episode 9, when they find Alison with her throat cut in Leonard's grandmother's place, Luther blames himself and apologises to Alison for not being there to protect her, like he believes he should have been. He sits at her bedside until she wakes up. And I honestly don't just think that's an Alison thing, I think it would be that way for any of the siblings. So I think it's safe to say this isn't a new added element to Luther. Some people seem to believe they've added new qualities to his character to make him more likeable in season 2, but what I see is excellent character writing and development, because these positive qualities we saw in Luther in season 1 are able to blossom in season 2. In season 2, Luther's caregiving personality type isn't a result of feeling like he has to lead and be in control, but it comes from a genuine kindness and desire to help, which is more collaborative and doesn't require any special status in return. Luther's personality hasn't changed, it's just that his outlook has. So in terms of Luther's journey in season 2, we do see him initially trying to step back from this caregiving role, and that seems like a contradiction because he naturally does gravitate towards a substitute father figure that he can look after, but what Luther doesn't do is feel any responsibility for the fate of the world or the people around him. I mean, he probably does still feel it, but he doesn't allow himself to entertain the notion that his feelings are important. When Five comes to see him at the burlesque club, Luther wants nothing to do with his new plan. He feels that to counter how he ended up with too much control over the plan and his siblings before, he now has no right to an input. I don't think Luther actually trusts himself with a position of authority now, and thinks that the best thing for him is to keep his head down, live an ordinary life, and not cause any trouble. From Luther, this is still a sacrifice, as he's denying himself happiness. He isolates himself not because he wants to. Luther hates being alone. In Series 1, he tells Five that it's the being alone that really messes you up. It's as a form of self-punishment, something we see echoed later on when Luther throws a fight because he wants to feel pain. Luther is so afraid of the harm he could cause at this point that instead of taking his frustration and upset out on his opponent, which is the easy choice, we see Luther opting to harm himself. It's actually Diego that manages to get Luther to realise that isolating and punishing himself isn't the answer, and that he's allowed to still have a say in the way the world is. So how does Luther's role as a caregiver personality develop and become more healthy in the second series? I'd argue he takes on an invaluable role in the team as peacemaker and mediator. Instead of leading discussions which result in conflict, Luther's primary function is to be there as a support for the others and to make sure everyone is okay. In the Diego, Vanya and Luther dynamic, which works surprisingly well, we see Luther acting as a support to Vanya, trying to show her his support and solidarity by telling Diego to put the knife away because Vanya is fine. The body language here is pretty interesting too, because Vanya is relaxed and comfortable beside Luther. In the alternate apocalypse 5 sees, Luther jumps into action to shield Klaus from a fireball, using his back to take the impact in what looks like a pretty painful experience. Luther isn't deployed first in this scene, Vanya is. So he's not acting as leader or initially attacking. He's jumping in as defense. Then in our actual final battle in episode 10 with the Commission, Lila and the Handler, we see Luther physically shielding Alison and Klaus with his body, seeing as these two have the least physical powers and need that protection. Klaus looks quite surprised and touched by this actually, as he does in the alternate apocalypse. Until now, he's thought Luther didn't care about him, but here is the proof that he really does. We have the second elevator scene where the family are returning from their terrible meeting with Reginald and trying to process it. Klaus is the sibling that the others often forget about, which is why nobody realised he was missing in season 1. When the siblings leave the elevator and Klaus is lying on the ground, it's Luther that remembers him and makes sure to bring him along with them. It's a small touch and funny too, but it's nice to think that Luther is remembering each of his siblings and keeping the group together. With 5, Luther becomes a spotter and seems pleased to be given this role. He doesn't fully understand the plan, but he goes along to protect 5. He's totally given up his idea of being leader here, and is happy to take instructions and look after his most difficult sibling. Luther's skill at mediation is utilised here, not that it works very well with 2 versions of number 5. Luther also acts as the morale booster of the group in season 2, which is something the team desperately needs. When they're all shown on TV as the country's most wanted, Luther says that at least they've restored the timeline and stopped Doomsday. Luther isn't the brightest of the siblings, but they really do need his optimism and can-do outlook. When 5 declares things hopeless, Luther waits loyally for him to emerge from his room, then encourages him by calling him a genius, which leads to results. In the final battle again, we have Luther leaving his position to go and help Alison to try and get her to breathe, and we also have him lifting a tractor off Diego. Again, he's less useful as an offensive part of the team, better as a defender of the others. I still think Luther has a way to go in learning that he doesn't have to put others or the world before himself every time, and that he's entitled to his own needs and wants, but he's definitely on an upward journey now and using his gifts at helping others in the right way. Now I want to talk about Luther and taking responsibility and accountability. Unlike a lot of the other siblings, Luther is the one with the ability to take criticism, reflect, and try to improve. In a lot of ways he takes this too seriously, which isn't surprising considering the way they were brought up. As number 1, he would have had to analyse each failure and take responsibility for it as team leader. At Ben's funeral, Luther doesn't look angry at Reginald's words, he looks upset, like he's taking them to heart, and like he really does believe it's his own fault. People like to imagine Luther as someone stubborn and pig-headed, but Luther's actually one of the less self-confident and one of the more likely to admit to mistakes and try to fix them. In fact, Luther feels guilt for mistakes so strongly that it becomes unhealthy for him. Again, we see this in the real world with parents who demand perfection, with kids beating themselves up for not being constantly perfect, and believing it's a fault in them, instead of just human nature to not be perfect all the time. But this season, Luther has got something he genuinely does need to be sorry for, and he doesn't disappoint. When I defend Luther from season 1, I'm not trying to say he wasn't in the wrong, because he was. It was his actions that led to the apocalypse, and his own issues that ended up turning Vanya into a bomb, probably more so than Leonard. Tom Hopper recently described Luther's most admirable trait as him desperately wanting to do the right thing, and we really see that this season. Part of sincerely wanting to do the right thing means that Luther is a character that puts himself out to make amends. Luther's had a year to think about what happened in 2019, and so when he sees Vanya in 1963, he knows what he has to do. A lot of people were waiting for and worried about Luther reuniting with Vanya, which is why the scene was played with a sinister edge at first, letting us guess at what the outcome would be. I'm not sure many people expected him to apologise, but again, I wasn't particularly surprised. From Luther's perspective, think about what a remarkably brave, good and noble thing it was to walk into that barn with Vanya. He has no idea she has amnesia, so he's walking into a room where she could murder him on the spot, and with good reason. But being Luther and having an understanding of responsibility, he takes that risk. He knows he owes it to Vanya to apologise, and what's even better is that he apologises without any hope of forgiveness. This is a real apology from Luther. It's not some half-hearted sorry if I upset you. He tells her that he let her down, that he did terrible things, that he should have helped her, and that in trying to keep everyone else safe, he made everything worse. Luther is thrown by Vanya's apparent amnesia, but he accepts that if Vanya is pretending to prevent having to associate with him, she has that right. He says that if she doesn't want to be found, he'll respect that and not bother her. Luther isn't expecting forgiveness. He doesn't think he deserves it and doesn't push Vanya for it. This gives us a real idea as to Luther's mindset. He simply isn't used to forgiveness. A mistake means rejection in his life and always has. This is one of the biggest lessons Luther learns this series, that the Academy love each other so deeply underneath it all, and have been through such trauma together, that they're able to understand each other's flaws, accept honest apologies, and be there for each other, even when it's hard. Being embraced by his family again, even after what he did, is so important for Luther's character, because he's never experienced that before. For the first time he's made a mistake, the hugest one possible, but he's been forgiven. He learns that love doesn't mean perfection, and that as long as your intentions are good and you make amends for your mistakes, you are still worthy of love. When Luther has been forgiven by his family, he can finally forgive himself, because it helps nobody for him to wallow in his mistakes. If he wants to make things right, he has to take positive action. I love this as a message for Luther because he represents the difficulty of adjusting to any sort of normal life after childhood and adulthood abuse. People in those situations aren't going to be perfect right away. They've been taught toxic and unhealthy ways of behaving and relating to people. Abused people often exhibit toxic traits of their own, something that not a lot of people like to talk about. But it's far more complex than being malicious. It often requires compassion and time to unlearn the lessons they've been taught all their lives. Someone who has just recognised they're an abuse victim won't be perfect. That's just not realistic. Sometimes they will lash out. They'll take it out on the wrong people. They'll be confused and humiliated. But Luther is not like his father because he's trying to do better and be better. So Luther is breaking the cycle. Another interesting strand for Luther in Season 2 is him trying to discover who he is. His whole life has been tied to his father, the missions, and the Academy. So when you take those things away, what do we have left? More than any of the others, Luther's not ever had a chance to develop a sense of self. So he's in a surreal situation. In Season 2, we see Luther learning to be more independent. Perhaps not emotionally at first, but at least in terms of knowing what it's like to earn a living. He's trying out his normal life, but it's still painfully lonely. Again, this shouldn't surprise us, because this is Luther's first try, and he's had no guidance whatsoever. Without his father's influence and the position his father gave him, Luther is a huge empty shell trying to figure out who he is and where his place is. Luther provides a lot of comedy in Season 2 for this reason. He's like an alien, like Steve Rogers waking up in the present day. It's like coming back from the moon for him all over again, only this time he's got to adjust to a different time period too. He has no idea how to be a 30-year-old man and exist in society. His casual conversation is hilariously boring, telling Ray Chestnut about the clean accommodation he lives in and the good rates. Luther is boring, but not for lack of personal qualities, but because he's never had hobbies before or interests that weren't related to training or missions. He's also endearingly polite and respectful, to the point that he clams up in conversation for fear of saying the wrong thing. He's desperate not to overstep, trying his best to be liked by whoever he's talking to. In his heartbreak at Alison's marriage, he politely offers Ray a chocolate and tries to be a good guest, which only makes him seem more unusual. Ray clearly thinks he's a total weirdo. Luther calls Sissy ma'am, and can't even help himself being polite to Olga Feroga on the phone. Luther wants to be liked and accepted, and has learned all his life that he needs to be on his best behaviour. He's scandalised when Five starts shouting in the street, calling him unseemly, which absolutely comes from Reginald putting the fear of God into him about diverting from the norm or doing anything unplanned or unexpected. I would love to see who the real Luther is in Season 3, to see what his hobbies are and what his interests are. There's definitely a sense that Luther's been reset and that he can start all over again. Now I want to talk about Luther's journey to accepting his abuse for what it was, and him getting to a point where he can stand up for himself. This realisation is triggered by his meeting with his father at the Academy and his terrible rejection of him. But what makes Luther so different this series is his acceptance of what was done to him. Luther is pretty straightforward, so he accepts that his father hurt him and broke his heart. He's one of the only siblings willing to show that vulnerability involved in accepting that, which actually puts him ahead of Diego in this regard, which is interesting, seeing as in Season 1, Diego was well ahead in criticising their father, and Luther was still in Reginald defence mode. When Diego tells Luther he was shanked in the heart by their father, Luther doesn't deny it, he doesn't feel the need to. When Luther gets high on laughing gas with Elliot, we see him finally getting to release the trauma of what happened to him. He's able to laugh at the absurdity of it, almost to detach and see the strange world he lived in for what it was. One of my favourite lines of the series, because of the way Tom Hopper delivers it, is, "He left me on the moon." But it does Luther good to commiserate with someone about just how shitty things have been. Elliot tells him that his wife left him, and tells Luther that at least he went places. Luther isn't on his own here. He's able to be with someone else with their own problems, and realise that sometimes life doesn't go the way you want, superhero or not. When 5 suggests they all go and seek Reginald's help, it's Luther that thinks that's a bad idea and leaves. He doesn't want to be running to their father for help anymore. He's past that point. In fact, the idea of it makes him uncomfortable. Later, when Diego and Vanya are with him, Diego tries to talk Luther round. Luther finally manages to talk casually about their father's cruelty, in telling Vanya all about him. He tells her, "Vanya, you of all people should hate Dad the most." Luther tells her he isolated you from the rest of the family. Diego joins in to say she was kept on pills, and Luther tells her that he brainwashed her into thinking she had no powers. Luther is absolutely comfortable now with saying that Reginald was a terrible father. Diego is the one that's actually desperate to face Reginald, but Luther would rather not see him at all, which again kind of demonstrates how Diego is still holding on to his father in a lot of ways, whereas Luther is in the process of letting go and moving on. Luther predicts Reginald will play his mind games, get into their heads, and turn them against each other. It's so refreshing for Luther to be able to reflect in this way and describe the sort of things that happened to them as children. Luther turns out to be right, because what Diego thinks is him finally getting to come face to face with his father in a triumphant moment ends up with Diego close to tears, and most of the others stunned into silence. Diego feels hurt in the lift that the others didn't stand up for him, but they were all pretty stunned by Reginald's cruelty and the resurfacing of the power he holds over them. Which brings us to Luther's development in terms of standing up for himself, and I am so happy for him. At the table, Luther tries his best to be assertive, even though we've seen how anxious he is about the meeting. He tells his father they won't just perform for him like clapping seals, and he says this loudly, half talking to the group and finding strength in them. When Reginald gets up to leave too soon, Luther rips open his shirt and yells, "Look at what you did to me!" which is honestly really funny, but it also shows that Luther is at a point where he can yell at his father. Alison praises him in the lift for standing up to Reginald for the first time, and Luther looks pleased with himself. It doesn't matter that Reginald paid no attention, what matters is that Luther wasn't afraid to talk back. In episode 5, 5 tries to stop Luther from leaving Morty's TV store where the siblings are meeting. He physically blinks into his way and tries to intimidate him. He tells Luther, "No one leaves until we figure this out." But at this point in his life, Luther won't be bullied. He pushes 5 out of the way, and this standing up for himself actually seems to make 5 respect him more and realise he's not someone who can be ordered about. Diego definitely seems quietly impressed that Luther didn't do as he was told. This makes Luther's interactions with 5 later on even better, because we know Luther's doing what he is because he wants to, not because he's being given orders that he feels he has to follow. Last of all, I want to talk about the ending of Luther's Season 2 arc. By the end of the series, and this is masterful, given that we've only had 10 episodes, and we have more than 8 leads to focus on, Luther has reached a point where his relationship with his family is totally different. Before, he was part of the academy because he felt he had to be, because that was what he was trained for. Now, he fights alongside his siblings because he loves them and they love him. He's loyal in a more personal way, which means now if he was faced with a decision between the world or an individual sibling, I think there's a good chance he'd go for saving the sibling. In a superhero, that can be a flaw, but in terms of personal growth, it's a huge change for Luther. When Lila faces off against him in the final episode, she tells Luther that she wants to kill his brother. Luther admits Diego can be a lot to handle. When she clarifies she means 5, Luther concedes that yes, 5 can be difficult too, but he tells her she's shit out of luck if she thinks he's going to hand them over, because they're his family. And then he takes her on. This encapsulates Luther's whole journey, the idea that people and relationships don't have to be perfect, and that family bonds will often be difficult, but at the end of it all, they'll be there for each other no matter what. Luther needs to know that for himself, that he can show his siblings a version of himself that isn't perfect, and they won't think any less of him for it. In this way, his siblings are giving him the parenting Reginald didn't. When Lila is told that the handler was using her, Luther is able to see a past version of himself in her. Lila claims that the handler loves her, but Luther is able to tell her the hard truth. He says, "Yeah, you know what? Love shouldn't have to hurt this much." He's finally found out what healthy family love is, and that he and his siblings are on a journey to help each other heal as a unit. Okay, thanks for watching this super long video essay / character analysis of Luther Hargreeves. There's going to be a series of videos like this, so watch this space. Next up will be number 2, Diego Hargreeves, who holds a special place in my heart. If you enjoyed this, then you can tip me via PayPal, and the link is in the description box. If not, then thanks for watching anyway and giving up your time. I would love to hear your thoughts on Luther Hargreeves in the comments below, and any further observations you might have in terms of his character development and psychology. There is so much more to say about Luther that I cut out of this video, so maybe when this little series is finished, I might make some more videos. Who knows? Who knows? Okay, thanks for watching and have a great day or night. Bye!